Welcome to another Jabba's Palace roll call. Today's character, Bomar Monks. We get our first and, I think, only glimpse of a Bomar monk in the scene at the start of Return of the Jedi, where the droids enter Jabba's palace. If you look closely, you can see something resembling a giant spider scuttling through the background, and for a long time I think I just assumed that it was another one of the weird aliens in Jabba's palace. As is often the case with this kind of thing, I'm not really sure how deep the backstory went at the time of filming, but they've definitely fleshed it out a lot since then. Basically, the Bomar monks were a religious order that emphasized contemplation of the mysteries of the universe and separating yourself from the distractions of the physical world. And in fact, they were the ones who originally built Jabba's palace on Tatooine. But they were so wrapped up in their own thoughts that they barely noticed when a series of outlaws, culminating in Jabba's gang, took over most of their monastery. This led to an odd situation where the monks and the criminal squatters more or less ignored each other while they were living in the same palace. Although many of the monks were still in humanoid form, we never actually saw them in this form in the film, and in fact, this Ralph McQuarrie concept art is one of the only places where they do appear that way. But we did see them in another form, which was as a disembodied brain being transported by a spider-like droid. And this is what we normally think of when we talk about Bomar monks. You see, they cared so much about separating themselves from the distractions of the physical world that their ultimate goal was to remove their brains and put them in glass jars, which were only placed into a droid when they needed to accomplish something physical and move around. The monks make a number of appearances in the short stories in Tales from Jabba's Palace, perhaps the most interesting of which is Of the Day's Annoyances, Bib Fortuna's Tale by M. Shane Bell, which describes how Bib Fortuna attempted to use the monks in his plot to overthrow Jabba, only to have them eventually outsmart him when he tries to take over the palace after Jabba's death in the sail barge explosion. The story ends with him about to have his brain removed like one of the monks. The monks also feature prominently in the book The Brain Spiders by John Whitman. This young reader's book was part of the Galaxy of Fear series of slightly spooky books, and tells the story of two young people named Zack and Tash who follow their Uncle Hool as he visits Jabba's palace to study the Bomar monks before the events of Return of the Jedi. The design of the monks was based on this concept art from Joe Johnston, although the final prop ended up being rather different, with 6 legs and proportions that are more spider-like. This maquette was closer to the final design, although it still only had 4 legs. The prop itself was built from scratch by Bill Hargreaves and was essentially a gigantic marionette operated by 3 men up in the rafters above it. They operated the legs to make it look like it was walking, although the body itself was actually suspended by cables. The full rig was about 60 feet wide and 28 feet tall, and the prop itself had a leg span of around 10 feet. It's an amazing amount of work for something that's only seen for a few seconds way in the background, but that's part of what I love about Star Wars. I think the first collectible based on the Bomar monk may have been the figure included in this Micro Machines set of droids from 1995. Here you can see it a little bit more closely. On the back, they've got a bit of a blurb about it as well, giving some of the background. As you can probably tell, the figure itself appears to be based on the concept sketch. So you can see that it's got 5 legs instead of 6, and it's also got a little turret there at the top. And it also doesn't look as much like a spider as the one we saw in the movie. The next version that I'm aware of, and the first actual action figure version, was this mail-away action figure from Kenner in 1997. They had some coupons that you could send off to have this sent to you, and later on you could also order it online. As you can see, it's in pieces, and you have to assemble it according to the instructions that they included. There's quite a bit of assembly required for a Star Wars figure, but once you do have it all put together, it looks a little something like this. And I think it's actually a really awesome looking figure. Looks a lot like a spider, as you might expect, and it's got the brain there visible in a clear jar, complete with some tinting on the bottom there to make it look like it's got some liquid in it. I'm really a fan of this figure. Later on, Hasbro would re-release the figure in a slightly different form as part of the Jabba's Palace Denizens figure pack. Released in 2004, this was essentially a straight repack of the original mail-away figure, but it had a few differences, like the color of the liquid in the bowl is pink instead of blue as on the original figure, and the color of the plastic and of the paint in general is a bit different, as you can probably see. LEGO released this version of the Bomar Monk in both its 2003 and 2012 versions of the Jabba's Palace set. You can see that it uses samurai swords for legs, which I always thought was rather clever. This one only has 4 legs, like the maquette version of the droid that I showed you earlier, but I guess in terms of canon, these can have either 4, 5, or 6 legs. In LEGO Star Wars 2, the original trilogy video game, they actually had rideable Bomar monks in the Jabba's Palace section. And thanks to a glitch, you could even become a Bomar monk briefly if you knew how to do it. The YouTuber Super Stupidity has a video explaining how to do this, and that's where I got these clips from, so I will include a link to that in the video description. One of the figures you could get for the Star Wars Miniatures game in 2005 was a Bomar monk, and as you can see, this one is a lot closer to what we saw in the film, more spider-like. The included card shows what powers the miniature would have in the game, and one of its powers is to dominate one of the other player's miniatures and take control of it for a turn, which is kind of interesting. Finally, while this isn't exactly a collectible, it was something that I thought was worth introducing. On StarWars.com in 2016, Kelly Knox wrote an article about how to make your own Bomar Monk craft for Halloween. She had you using things like a black paper lantern, a large plastic snow globe, and some pink food coloring and water to recreate a relatively decent version of a Bomar Monk, and I just thought this was pretty cute. That's it for today's video about the Bomar monks. They're definitely one of my favorite sort of very obscure background characters. Stay tuned for more Jabba's Palace roll call entries in the future. Thanks for watching.